business architect, but not necessarily an enterprise architect or a solution architect or other sorts of architecture roles. Now, when we take a flip, we flip it around and say, so what does TOGAF say about business analysis? Well, not a lot, which is, it wasn't that surprising to me, having, much like yourselves, having been involved in TOGAF and applying it in practice, but it was just kind of a pretty gory, realistic affirmation that we certainly have a real opportunity, I think, in TOGAF to more broadly embrace business analysis. So neither IABA or the BABOK are referenced at all, which to me seems like a real shortcoming, particularly as the Open Group's tagline is, making standards work, and I have always interpreted that as being very broad, that it's not just about Open Group standards, it's about all standards. So I submitted a change request for the next version of TOGAF to at least insert reference to the professional association, IABA, and or the body of knowledge, particularly around requirements management, which we'll talk more about later, that we should at least call out and make sure that everybody knows there is this thing called the BABOK, and it's got a lot of good stuff in it that could really help architects perform their activities a little bit more prescriptively than what TOGAF suggests. Business analysis is only mentioned a single time. The word requirement, so this is kind of the flip side of, the BABOK mentioning model 783 times. Well, coincidentally and oddly, requirement is mentioned 780 times in TOGAF 9.1. Requirements management is mentioned 61 times. And of course, architecture requirements management is the circle in the middle of the ADM. And we'll talk, obviously more about that in a little bit. So it seems, very obvious that because the preponderance of requirements being a central theme and topic throughout TOGAF, and BABOK certainly being the internationally recognized set of best practices around requirements management and other business analyst activities, that there's a real gap here from the TOGAF side. And also, when we take a look at the TOGAF skills framework, there isn't even an acknowledgement that a business analyst exists and could be a part of the team, and what kind of skills they might be able to contribute. As many of you might know, the skills framework talks about, 5 different architect roles: enterprise, business data application technology architect, as well as sponsors of architecture work and board members, and architecture management, project managers, and designers. But again, seems to be an oversight to not include business analysts in that perspective. And then if we take a look at what does each body of knowledge think about what the profession is about, the actual roles and responsibilities of the individual. So right at the very beginning of the BABOK, there's a description of what a business analyst is, responsible for discovering, synthesizing, and analyzing information from lots of sources, responsible for eliciting needs of stakeholders, to determine underlying root causes and associated issues, plays a role in aligning the solutions that are going to be delivered with the needs of those stakeholders. So, when I look at that from an enterprise architect's lens, I sure go, boy, that sure sounds, pretty familiar. And then when we look at it from the TOGAF side, TOGAF at the end of the standard talks about an enterprise architect being visionaries, coaches, team leaders, business technical liaisons, computer scientists, and industry experts. So right off the bat, I think it's an interesting choice of words that you might get a sense out of TOGAF that, the enterprise architects are pretty special people. We've got, exemplary, incredible skills. We're extraordinary individuals. We're so much smarter and better than everybody else, at least when you compare it to the language that is used in the BABOK for business analysts. And I think this, and I don't want to read too much into it, but I think it's a good opportunity to just throw out there one of the, kind of cultural personality things that we've often seen with architects. I know I work really hard, try not to fall into this pitfall. Perhaps don't do as good a job as I could sometimes, but there is certainly a general sense in many organizations, particularly from communities like the business analysts, that the enterprise architects are arrogant. that they think they're better than everybody else and smarter than everybody else. And it's hard perhaps not to, substantiate that with this very flowery language that TOGAF uses to talk about how great enterprise architects are. So I think we, while, like everybody else, we have specialized skills and play a special role, I do think that balancing, and understanding the difference between confidence and arrogance is sometimes a challenge for some of us in the architecture profession. And, continuing on, the architects have professional relationships with executives to gather and articulate the vision and produce a strategy for realizing it. And there's a summarization of what an architect does as being responsible for understanding and interpreting requirements, creating useful models, validating, refining, and expanding those models, and overall managing the architecture. So certainly the first bullet, understanding and interpret requirements, is an obvious suggestion that, well, enterprise architects have to be able to do requirements pretty well. So it does bring up an interesting perspective is, in order to be an effective enterprise architect, do you need to be a good business analyst? And I believe the answer is absolutely, certainly true. However, one of the things to think about also is when we think about the way that we have, different individuals across the organization with different skill sets, should we as enterprise architects be presuming that we need to play that business analyst role? Now, I think ultimately, again, enterprise architects, and in fact all architects, do need to be good business analysts, but that doesn't mean we have to do all of the business analyst activities in the architecture work that we're asked to perform. So, when I try to frame out, again, these two different frameworks and kind of how they overlap, I thought about maybe, it could be best described with this 2x2, where the different dimensions are, whether the framework is descriptive, that is, describes, what you're supposed to do, as opposed to prescriptive, how to do it, and how it relates to the EA and BA domain. So I've always generally thought that TOGAF is predominantly a descriptive framework. It tells you a lot about what you're supposed to do in enterprise architecture, but doesn't get into a lot of how, particularly the ADM and the architecture repository are pretty conceptual level perspectives. The two reference models in TOGAF, the TRM and the triple IRM, are certainly prescriptive. Again, as many of you know, you're not required to use them, but they definitely get into more of the how to do certain kinds of things. Some of the guidelines that are in Part 3 are very much on, again, optional guidance on how you might do certain kinds of things like stakeholder management or business scenarios or interoperability requirements. And very much the TOGAF architecture content meta model, while not, I don't consider it even a logical model, more of a conceptual model, is definitely providing more guidance from TOGAF 8 about, how to manage enterprise architecture content. And then if we take a look at the BABOK 3.0, the core concepts, and I'm going to be going through these different things for folks that perhaps aren't familiar with it. The core concepts in the BABOK 3 are, again, what business analysts do and what business analysis is about. But I really look at the knowledge areas as being more prescriptive. Again, it doesn't necessarily come out and specifically say, what your requirement specification needs to look like, but certainly talks about what content should be inside of it. But just the level of detail in the description of the behaviors, activities, inputs, and outputs is certainly more fine-grained than what we see in the ADM. There's a lot of guidelines, so a lot of good stuff on how to do certain types of things, and the additional perspectives at the end of the body of knowledge, I think, don't get down to that same level, but again, at least try to inform business analysts what they need to be thoughtful about when they're playing in the business architecture space or IT space and others. And just to make things, a little bit more interesting, this might be a topic for a subsequent webinar, is how does the BABOK fit into that? And as many of you may know, the BABOK is the body of knowledge of business architecture from the Business Architecture Guild. And I think that has also overlap with both bodies of knowledge. Again, not quite, a little bit more prescriptive than TOGAF is, particularly, of course, in the business architecture space. but it does touch on, I think, some of the same concerns business analysis does as well. So I think, ultimately, and I'll be curious to see what some of the responses might be for some of the poll questions is, how many organizations have adopted in some fashion or another these different frameworks, and have you taken any steps towards trying to figure out how to reconcile their interoperability? If we take a look at, the enterprise architecture value chain, which some of you this may look familiar because I think this was one of our first sessions, I think about a year ago. And this is a body of work that I and a couple other folks have been working on at the Open Group in the Enterprise Architecture Capability Improvement Project, where we came up with this value chain to really describe what do architects do, understand things. Once we understand them, then we can analyze that content to come up with different alternatives and perspectives. Then we can apply architectural rigor and thinking for making informed, data-driven decisions, and then ultimately respond to the initial or whatever the opportunities are, and actually, deliver solutions upon that strategy. And if, frame, what are business analysts trying to do and how does that fit into this value chain, there's certainly a lot of overlap in the first two steps of the value chain, understand and analyze, particularly the requirements elicitation and requirements management activities that are in the knowledge management part of the supporting capabilities. And as we'll see in a little bit, the BABOK has a host of, I think, 50-plus techniques, and 12 of them are, have the word analysis in them. So certainly the BABOK thinks that, there's a lot of ways to do analysis, and some of the ones are the ones that you see represented on this slide, but there's a whole bunch of additional ones. So again, a real call out to the opportunity for enterprise architects to exploit some of those more prescriptive techniques. So I presume everybody here, is generally familiar with the architecture development method. This was thrown up again to help, contextualize the discussion for the business analyst community. And, the obvious thing about this is the, requirements management that's in the middle of the crop circle. And as you probably all know, the whole idea behind this is that, requirements management is central to the ADM. And that the ADM is driven by requirements, and that we gather requirements throughout the life cycle, and they flow in and out and in between one another. So, to me, that's, and perhaps to many of you guys on the call, as consequently also said, it's pretty obvious that there's some affinity between TOGAF and BABOK, at least in the requirements management circle in the middle. But, there are some differences as it relates to, the scope of the body of work. My opinion, based on practice as well as looking at the framework, that BABOK is particularly, but certainly not exclusively, project scoped. So there's a little diagram that you see in the middle left that, looks at the two different dimensions of, potential going all the way to delivering actual solutions. And the idea that there are, core activities are really done in the context of projects, but there are some pre-project activities and post-project activities, including, strategy analysis. That's one of the knowledge areas in version 3, and solution evaluation once the IT solution or business solution has been delivered. So, there are ADM-like activities at the beginning and the ending of the more project-focused solution delivery lifecycle. And as I hope, many people here know that in the ADM, when we're using this to drive transformation, we, really don't know exactly what the projects are until after we've done architecture work in A through D. So when we're in phases E and F, that's where we actually identify the projects. So many of you, again, also probably are familiar with the handful or two of techniques and guidelines within Part 3. And the ones that are bold italicized are things that are referenced in the BABOK in one way or another, either as a explicit technique or certainly by reference based on the intent and the outcomes of doing these things. So stakeholder management, obviously, is a big central part of being an effective business analyst, and there's a lot of good guidance in the BABOK around that. You know, business scenarios, we'll talk a little bit more about that later, is a technique for helping to synthesize an architecture vision if you don't have one. Gap analysis is one of the techniques that's mentioned in the BABOK. Readiness assessment is something that's talked about in the business architecture perspective, and the strategy analysis. Risk management certainly is a theme through most frameworks, as well as the notion of capability-based planning. But when we flip it around and take a look at what the BABOK has to offer, you know, the thing that's most obvious when you look at this list is, boy, this list is a lot bigger, richer, and more specific than TOGAF. So this is part of, you know, the rationale why I think, you know, BABOK is a little bit more prescriptive than TOGAF. Again, all of these things are optional. You're not required or obligated to use them. But the authors of the content, you know, certainly found an opportunity to get more specific with a lot of the different ways that we can actually do certain business analysis activities. And the ones that are in bold and italicized here are those that are explicitly mentioned in some form within TOGAF. So business capability analysis, risk analysis and management, stakeholder lists, maps, personas, use cases and scenarios. But of course, that's not to say by any means that the rest of these techniques are not useful and possibly very helpful to performing enterprise architecture work. It's just that TOGAF doesn't necessarily explicitly call some of those things out. So, you know, this is, again, an obvious place where if you're looking for a little bit more richness in the techniques that you might use as an enterprise architect when doing ADM activities, the BABOK has a lot of great stuff to offer. Now, something that's new in BABOK 3.0 is called the Business Analysis Core Concept Model, the BACCM, and that's referenced here on the left-hand side of this slide. And this is pretty conceptual, so it's not necessarily expected to be a, you know, again, a prescriptive way of keeping track of business analysis content, but it's very similar in spirit, perhaps at a little higher level of abstraction than the same thing that we see in the TOGAF architecture content meta model. And what I'm trying to do here is, you know, show that there is certainly some correlation from my perspective between the two, you know, schemes for different kinds of semantics. So the notion of what are called changes in the BACCM, I think, are mapped pretty well to capabilities and work packages in opportunities and solutions. This notion of solutions in the BACCM certainly refer to the implementation portions of the business and data and application architecture. So if we're changing org structure, relocating, you know, uplifting processes, doing new things with data or applications. Don't want to suggest that people doing business analysis don't care about technology, but we tend to see that those things usually come in, quite honestly, from architecture as a set of constraints about preferred solutions and frameworks. So that's why, you know, excluded it from the mapping there. The context, why are we doing, and understanding why are we doing business analysis, I think has a lot to do with all four of the architecture domains. I really think that's ultimately what we're trying to get our arms around in phases A through D in the ADM. Value, you know, what are we getting out of doing business analysis work? What are expected outcomes? That certainly maps well to the motivation layer of the business architecture. Stakeholders maps very nicely to the notion of stakeholders in the vision, and then needs certainly map to the different perspectives of architecture requirements. So, you know, the BABOK concept model is more general. The TOGAF architecture content model is a little bit more specific, but as some of you may know, there actually are, again, two different kinds of architectures that are identified in the knowledge areas, namely a business analysis information architecture and a requirements architecture. And those are both ultimately, you know, call outs to, in order to do effective requirements management and business analysis, we need to have a strategy in place for the semantics for those different types of concerns and work products, how they're related to one another. That's often where we express a traceability strategy. So there's certainly an opportunity for people that want to take a broader view in business analysis that they could look at the TOGAF architecture content meta model as a good reference and starting point. Then when we get to the enterprise repositories in TOGAF, which again I really think of as being a conceptual model of a set of federated actual repositories within an enterprise. The meta model that's referenced up in the upper right, that certainly should incorporate some aspects of the business analysis, information architecture, and requirements architecture, because my opinion, and this might be me as the architect, would say I don't think we need to have two separate meta models, one for architecture, one for requirements, but hopefully we can come up with an integrated one where we can all play together and do good work and share the valuable results of each of our investments. The standards and information space, as you all know, that's where we store architecture building blocks within that are mentioned in TOGAF. And those, may reference standards and specifications that may be constraints that are placed upon projects and solutions that are delivering on stakeholder requirements. And similarly, standard technology products and standard applications, those would be referenced in the solutions repository as solution building blocks. And as some of you may know, in TOGAF 9.1, we added a requirements repository, which I think was at least a great, step forward to say, hey, let's, remember that requirement circle in the middle of the ADM? Well, we need some place to manage those requirements, and the choice was made to, make it, put it outside of the architecture repository for a couple of reasons. To recognize that, at least I think, that there are tools that can help us manage all this content, as you probably know, and that there may be a different class or set of tools that we want to use for requirements management that's different from a lot of the traditional modeling we do in enterprise architecture. I think we want to be careful about taking an EA modeling tool particularly and trying to turn it into a requirements management tool or vice versa. However, we've done it with clients. You do what makes sense given the environment. But again, just keep in mind that there are, technology solutions out there to help each of the professions, and we need to come up with an integrated strategy for how they work together. And should architects be using, the same tool that the business analysts are using for requirements management? Because if requirements are requirements, why are they being managed differently in a different place? And similarly, the business analyst, perhaps they could be using some of the modeling solutions that we have in place to do some of the architecture, as opposed to what we often do, not just business analysts, use Microsoft Office productivity tools like PowerPoint and Visio. One of the things I think is interesting about both bodies of knowledge is they both felt compelled to redefine what a requirement is. I know I had, and we actually were going through this again in the open group as it relates to, the next version of TOGAF and other bodies of work. I like to think that, again, in the architecture forum of all places, that we would understand the value of aligning with standards. So, TOGAF has a definition for a requirement, a quantitative statement of need that must be met by a particular architecture or work package. I've always felt that definition just seems kind of weird. It's not completely out of alignment with other perspectives, but particularly the whole idea that it's quantitative. Particularly, as you'll see a little bit later, how TOGAF differentiates the architecture requirement spec as being a quantitative thing and the architecture definition document being a qualitative, intentional thing. I think that differentiation is terribly subjective and arbitrary. BABOK defines a requirement as a usable representation of need. I think calling out the appropriateness of, one of the big things a good business analyst is able to do is to elicit something out of a stakeholder that they don't know they know, and capture it in such a way that really represents the essence of that need in a way that makes it usable by a broader community. But both of these, again, bodies of knowledge, could have just said, well, maybe we should just align ourselves with an existing international standard for requirements, ISO 29148, where that defines a requirement as a statement that translates or expresses a need and its associated constraints and conditions. So next, a couple of slides, we'll talk about ADM requirements management. Just a quick review. What is the point of that? Well, first of all, I've always thought that the requirements management is actually not a phase of the ADM like all the other phases. It's really a common set of activities that are really a part of all the phases, so that you don't necessarily just manage requirements. That's some step in your process. It should be a pervasive, ongoing regular activity throughout the life cycle. So the whole point in TOGAF is to, again, given that it's really, again, a descriptive method, doesn't get into a lot of specifics, but at least says, hey, make sure that you have a requirements management process in place and that it's operational and sustainable throughout the ADM life cycle, not just, again, a single life cycle, but also capture those requirements and manage them across possibly multiple execution cycles, as well as making those requirements available to other areas such as solution delivery. And again, make sure that those requirements are available for use throughout the life cycle as we execute the ADM. And this is, this has caused, in a number of environments, we've had some very interesting discussions with people about what the heck do you mean by architecture requirements? Because technically the middle of the circle is ADM architecture requirements management, which kind of makes one think, so are architecture requirements special and different than normal requirements? Well, what you're seeing here is, my opinion, based on practice. This is not necessarily the position of TOGAF at this point, but architecture requirements ultimately, in my experience, are any requirement that has to do with executing architecture activities. So there are a set of requirements that will initiate the ADM. You're sitting in phase H, architecture change management, and one of the reasons that often is the trigger for a new target architecture is you've understood that there are now new requirements that we have to respond to. What those expected outcomes are when we're actually trying to put together a team to come up with that plan and approach, that's really what phase A is about. There are going to be requirements collected in phases B, C, and D in the different architecture domains that are going to really talk about what the target architecture needs to deliver, as well as the possible interim transition architectures. And then I've always thought that, the architecture requirements, some of the architecture requirements may actually get addressed by architecture work directly, particularly as it might have to do with creating new reference architectures or reference models. But that a large number of those requirements we identify in the ADM, we don't actually address directly until solution delivery takes off in phase G. So we need to make sure that there's a clear handoff between those requirements we've identified in A through D, how we've allocated them preliminarily to the projects that we've identified in phases E and F, and again, make sure those projects, have those requirements within their scope. And that includes not just, requirements of the, of the software that's being acquired, configured, or built, but also business and IT operational requirements that have to be put into place once the solutions are delivered. Again, the architecture and solution building blocks may represent constraints, where again, I see a lot of, actually in practice, a lot of subject matter experts that portend to be business analysts often really struggle with. Namely, we see a lot of things about more how things are supposed to be done as opposed to what people's expectations are. Things where a business analyst or a subject matter expert says, well, all we need is, a drop-down list box on screen 4 populated with these values. And that would really be, considered user interface design, not so much requirements. So I think we, again, want to make sure that we, keep people within the right parts of the levels of abstraction. But there certainly are a certain set of requirements that are of particular interest to architects, namely interoperability, security requirements, and non-functional requirements. The BABOK has a requirements classification scheme, basically 4 levels: business requirements, stakeholder, solution, and transition requirements. And in this slide, I'm just trying to represent a general mapping between when in the ADM might these different kinds of requirements come up. So generally speaking, why do I want stuff? Business requirements would certainly be a part of launching the ADM in Phase H and trying to get our arms around different perspectives in Phase A. Again, what are the needs are really going to be a major focus of Phase A and Phase E, particularly as it relates to delivery. Solution requirements certainly come out in Phases B, C, and D, as well as, again, like we were just describing how those are transitioned into solution delivery in Phase G. And then the transition requirements are an obvious match to the things that we need to put in place and think about when we're putting together our plans in Phase E. And then the next slide here is a coarse-grained generalized mapping between the two sets of activities in the bodies of knowledge. On the upper left, we have the knowledge areas in the BABOK, business analysis, planning and monitoring, strategy analysis, requirements analysis, design definition, so on and so forth. So, generally speaking, the kind of things that we're doing in the preliminary phase are very similar to what we're trying to do in planning and monitoring, just establishing the business analyst capability and supporting it. There's certainly a lot of affinity in the strategy analysis knowledge area for really the entirety of the ADM, particularly phases A through E. There's no doubt that the sweet spot, I think, in particular, for at least from a TOGAF perspective, is the requirements management in the middle, bigger, obvious call out for exploiting the requirements lifecycle management and elicitation and collaboration best practices. Certainly requirements analysis and design definition, a part of Phase F leading into Phase G when we actually are trying to figure out what solution delivery projects have to do. And then once those solutions are delivered, the solution and evaluation knowledge area would make a lot of sense at towards the end of Phase G. And the obvious thing as well is that whatever solution delivery method you are going to be executing during Phase G, there's a huge opportunity to exploit the BABOK for the business analyst activities during solution delivery. Now, the next number of slides, and given the time we've got here, about 10 minutes or so, if we leave a little bit of time for questions, is going to be looking at the different parts of the ADM and where the BABOK and business analysts may provide some guidance and help. And obviously, the most obvious one is the requirements management activity. So here you're seeing an excerpt from the APG TOGAF process library where we took the bulleted lists of activities in each of the phases and created UML activity diagrams to represent kind of a workflow. This is an obvious call out that whatever we're doing here in phase, excuse me, not in this phase, but in these requirements management activities, we should certainly be looking to exploit a big part of what the BABOK has to offer. And then if we get into the, the framework and principles phase, the preliminary phase, when we're scoping the enterprise organizations impacted, that's certainly where we want to have some discussions between the two different communities. And then when we define the architecture, organization, and team, take it to the next level and actually talk about how are the enterprise architecture and business analysis communities going to work together as an integrated team. And then when we finally get to implementing our architecture tools, we need to come up with an approach for integrating whatever tools we have for doing architectural solution modeling and requirements, and harmonize that usage of those tools across the two different communities. Architecture vision is another obvious place where business analysts can really make a significant contribution, since really, in my opinion, the Phase A architecture vision is really a scoping activity. It's really trying to make sure that we're all on the same page of, do we understand or do we agree there is a problem that could be solved, that we understand some critical aspects of that problem and feel that it's worthwhile solving that problem. So in this activity diagram here, we actually went a little bit beyond what TOGAF says, because oddly enough, there's nothing in TOGAF that says the business architect does anything in Phase B business architecture. So the affinity between the roles and the skills framework and the activities in the ADM, there's just absolutely no explicit connection. But it seemed to us at APG that a certain subset of Phase A activities are very well, certainly appropriate for business analysts to perform directly. I mean, we just don't need enterprise architects doing everything. So there are requirements management activities around confirming and elaborating goals and drivers and constraints, defining scope, identifying stakeholders, concerns, and requirements. Those are, to us, obvious business analyst things, so why not have those individuals join the team? Developing the architecture vision, the architecture vision deliverable, in my opinion, is ultimately a high-level requirement specification, so there's certainly a lot of synergy there. Organizational change management and development activities, and the third swim lane here is another thing that's regularly acknowledged in the BABOK. And there is a KPI technique, if you're interested, for some of the project management activities that we might be able to exploit. Then there's, one of the techniques that TOGAF has to offer is business scenarios. And this is basically, again, not a requirement, but it's the whole idea that when you're doing Phase A architecture vision and you're not sure how you might do those activities, you may choose to use the business scenario technique. I know when I first looked at it many years ago, I was like, oh, this sure seems like the requirements management and business analysis approach I've always used in solution delivery, at least in concept. So I basically said, now I get what they mean by a business scenario for doing an architecture vision, but we already have best practices in place based on our requirements management and business analyst capabilities, so we're going to go with that, and that's one of the regular recommendations we make when talking about implementing TOGAF is, please, oh please, do not invent a new method or technique for doing something when there very likely is already one of these already in place in your organization. Take your solution delivery, scoping, approach and uplift it to enterprise architecture. It still may require some tweaking and things like that, but in my opinion, no reason to reinvent the wheel. And then when we get into phases B through D, and really describing the baseline and the target architectures for the 4 different domains, there's certainly requirements-related activities here as well. The first step, which currently in TOGAF 9.1 is described or is called selecting reference models, viewpoints, and tools, is really about eliciting requirements for doing modeling. Namely, before we start describing the baseline and the target architecture, let's make sure we understand who we're modeling for, what their concerns are, and that whatever modeling approach we take is going to address those concerns. So it's ultimately a requirements elicitation activity. Even though it doesn't call it out in, at this level in the steps, you are supposed to be also capturing architecture requirements when you're building the baseline and target architecture descriptions. BABOK happens to have a review technique because the content in TOGAF around step 7, conduct formal stakeholder review, I think is like 3 sentences. So we certainly could look at the BABOK for a little bit more guidance if we're not sure about that. And not surprising because, this is an architecture body of knowledge. The last step of phases B, C, and D is creating the architecture definition document. But as many of you may know, that is really a partner to the architecture requirement specification that really need to be developed together. So in addition to creating the architecture definition document, we also need to create that architecture requirement specification. And just a little bit of commentary on those 2 things. Again, the current version of TOGAF, defines the definition document as a qualitative view that aims to communicate intent. Ultimately, I've always thought of the ADD as an Uber document that contains, as you see here, all of the artifacts that represent the current state, the future state, transition architectures, business data application and technology, but that cannot live without the requirement specs, so they're very appropriate companions. But I've always taken issue with again, my opinion, the arbitrariness of that the definition document and the models out of there are qualitative. And perhaps this is, related to my personal experience where I've enjoyed the privilege of using a lot of tools with a lot of different modeling languages where, you know, I've had experience, and perhaps many of you have as well, that you can create quantitative, very explicit specifications using models. They're not qualitative. So again, that differentiation, I think, is pretty arbitrary. Where again, the architecture requirement spec is a set of quantitative statements that describe what projects have to do to comply with the architecture. That's a little inconsistent with the definition of a requirement that TOGAF makes, you know, that we saw a little earlier. Again, many of the requirements in the spec are going to be things that the solution delivery has to address, but some of them actually might be addressable by the architecture content itself. And again, I don't think there's anything particular about a requirement that makes it quantitative as opposed to models being qualitative. What I will say, and I'm sure you guys have shared this experience, that in any endeavor, enterprise architecture, solution delivery, whatever level of abstraction we're at, we need both a textual way to represent different stakeholder concerns and a graphical way. And they're really, again, partners to one another. And, you know, we should write things in text as quote-unquote traditional requirements if that's the best way to address those concerns, but we can also similarly get very precise and prescriptive with models. When we get into the end of the life cycle, phase E, opportunities and solutions, again, we've identified that, you know, a subset of phase E activities certainly could be done by business analysts, namely determining the implementation constraints and consolidating the requirements across the landscape. In phase F, migration planning, you know, one of the first steps we're supposed to do is understand how the different frameworks are going to work with one another, and so this is where we would talk about how is enterprise architecture and business analysis going to work together at the solution delivery level. You know, the BABOK has techniques to help with some of these activities, namely creating business cases, doing prioritization and estimation, lessons learned. And again, while there's a special call out in, you know, the third to the last step around confirming the roadmap and updating the definition document, that will also involve updating the architecture requirement specification. In phase G, implementation governance, you know, and one thing about this diagram is this is, probably should annotate it to make sure people understand that this is something we execute for every project. Not just once like the other ADM workflow diagrams. So for every project, we want to make sure that they understand which architecture requirements they're responsible for implementing and the constraints that they're going to be held to, particularly as it relates to architecture and product standards. In identifying development resources, this is where we should talk more specifically with the individuals that are playing architecture and business analyst roles and how we're going to work together, and the operational requirements that we've gathered need to be implemented into the second to the last step. And then finally, phase H, architecture change management. As we, you know, talked about a little bit earlier, it's in fact the identification of new requirements that, you know, triggers a new cycle of architecture development. So the analysis for doing that architecture change is, you know, often is driven by an accumulation of enough new requirements or perhaps a statutory or regulatory deadline. We need to develop those change requirements. That's, you know, in this view, the responsibility of the board, but certainly should seek to enlist the help of business analysts in that. And then the request for architecture work, that's the outcome of this that triggers the next cycle of ADM, needs to include some initial stakeholder assessments, needs and requirements. So again, another obvious place for business analysts to help us out. So ultimately, you know, from an APG perspective, we have this way of looking at, you know, the integrated business technology landscape where, you know, strategic planning really sets the stage for everything. Again, hopefully enterprise architecture can help inform that. Not surprising, being enterprise architects, we think, you know, enterprise architecture is, you know, providing the context for pretty much all the other IT activities as it relates to portfolio and program and project management, solution delivery and systems engineering. But, you know, there's certainly an important recognition that business analysis and requirements management, again, are central to making sure that all those things are connected to one another and operate effectively. And then, of course, once those solutions are put into operations, we want to support that with a good service management framework and surrounded by an effective governance approach. So in conclusion, the BABOK recognizes TOGAF and EA a little bit more broadly and explicitly than TOGAF does in reverse. There's a lot of great best practices in the BABOK for supporting requirements management activities, and really, having a call out to why don't we actually explicitly involve business analysts as key contributors to EA projects. There's certainly a lot of great guidance in BABOK on how to do requirements management and analyst activities and solution delivery for Phase G. There's certainly overlap and some similarities in techniques and models. My characterization is, the BABOK has more techniques, many of which could, and perhaps in your experiences, you have already used them when doing enterprise architecture work. TOGAF is a little bit more specific on modeling, which certainly could be exploited by business analysts. The strategy analysis knowledge area, if people wanted to do that more rigorously, I would really call them to look at the, the ADM phases A through F for that. We could certainly strengthen enterprise architecture initiatives by more integrally involving business analysts, and a lot of business analyst activities can be and should be performed in the context of the broader enterprise architecture perspective. So I guess that's the end of the presentation, everybody. Thanks so much. We've got some, candidate topics for future webinars. We'll, Birgit and the AEA will be, keeping you in the loop once we come to some decisions on that. And I just wanted to thank you for your attention and participation. If we have any time for any questions, I'd be happy to take those. If not, I can try to address those in written form afterwards.
Correct. We do have some time for questions. So we received a question from Jim Weller in Alaska, and he says, what guidance do you offer to using these frameworks for the business without having to educate them against their will? We need to see the outcomes without having to become the architects themselves. How do you make this resonate in the boardroom?
Well, I think the biggest thing is, if I get, just a part of the question is, some of this stuff is related to internal implementation details, right? Because, from the business perspective, if we casually say, well, a lot of this stuff, the business analysts and the enterprise architects are doing their thing in IT, the business people aren't going to be, they're not going to care about whether it's TOGAF or BABOK or so on and so forth. I think, one of the value propositions to throw out there is, well, enterprise architects tend to be pretty expensive resources in most organizations. So why are they performing activities that other people could perform? I also think, although I don't have any empirical statistics, my anecdotal perspective is that the BA community outnumbers the EA community by at least an order of magnitude, 10 to 1. So there are a lot more business analysts out there, which means, hey, there's a whole bunch of resource that we could actually exploit and really take advantage of their specialized skill set, and really try to make, again, enterprise architecture more of a multidisciplinary activity as opposed to something that is perceived as something that has to be done by enterprise architects. However, there are some other resourcing models that suggest, particularly around lean IT, that we want to be careful about over-proliferation of ultra-specialized individuals. So, enterprise architects that, can apply the BABOK techniques is one way to solve that problem, as well as business analysts that can, perform some enterprise architecture techniques. And, I'm interested to see the results of an earlier poll question that asked you guys, do you have enterprise architects that are certified in BABOK stuff? And do you have business analysts that are certified in TOGAF stuff, which I think would provide and that's what we've seen, there is a little bit of overlap, that there, again, may be some real substance into making that happen.
Okay, Chris, I don't know. Yep, we can do one more. There's another one. What would you think about an organization like the Open Group that would be able to build up the initiatives taken by some of the major professional bodies such as IEEE, OMG, et cetera, around the consolidation of the global knowledge needed by the EA professions?
Well, I guess being a member of, both the OMG and the Open Group, as well as IIBA, I think, we certainly could exploit again the skill set and resources of architects in the Open Group, where a big part of our mission, right, in most enterprises is to support and enable interoperability. Usually it's at the the business process or application technology level, but since as architects we claim that that's one of our specialized skill sets, is how do we figure that out? It would make a lot of sense for me that a community like the Open Group could help address that. There has been some prior art in similar initiatives, particularly one I was involved in a number of years ago called the Synergy Project, where we tried to do some alignment between OMG modeling specifications and usage of them in the ADM. So there certainly is precedence that could be done at the Open Group. But as some of you may know, there is another organization, the Federated Enterprise Architecture Professionals Association, of which I'm pretty sure Birgit, AEA, is a member of. Is really, the professional association on over all architecture professional associations. And, I don't think we really do much work within that body, but that could possibly be a venue to call people to action. So I'm hoping that at least in the next version of TOGAF, we get a recognition that the BABOK is a useful body of knowledge to help with enterprise architecture. And maybe we'll, work on creating some white papers like we did in the Synergy Project, that kind of touch on some of the points I made today.
Great, so that ends our session today. Watch this space for the next one. The session was recorded and will be available on the AEA site along with the slide deck. And I'm sure Chris probably will use those poll questions to work up another presentation WebEx. So watch the space. We'll be sending out an announcement. And Chris, thank you for doing another very informative and engaging webinar with the AEA today. If you have additional questions, do feel free to send to us via chat or to Chris Armstrong. And that ends our session for today. Thank you all for participating. And thank you, Chris.
Thank you very much, everybody, for your time this morning. Have a great weekend.